Hi again, it's Jeff, and we're working through some examples together on modeling with Fusion 360. And in the last video, we went through an example that was illustrating the basic workflow, which is that when you're working on a model, you typically create a two-dimensional sketch, and you do an operation on that sketch to create your 3D bodies. And that basic back and forth between 2D sketches and 3D manipulation is the basic workflow of Fusion 360. There are definitely other operations, there's definitely other tools to use, but the bulk of what we're going to do is going to use that workflow. There's a new idea I want to talk about in this next video, which really has to do more with 3D modeling in general. And the idea is that complicated 3D models, even ones that have lots of features, lots of details, are generally built out of simple primitives that are arranged in a certain way to create complicated models. Let's just talk briefly through a couple of examples. This is a bottle, a very simple example. If you're to take a look at this object, you can see that it's really not much more than a series of cylinders that are stacked together. Right? Cylinder is sort of a primitive shape, along with cubes and cones and things like that. And in a modeling environment, we could draw a larger, lower cylinder, a smaller one on top, and a still smaller one on top of that. And we would roughly represent the shape of this object. We can go back and add other refining features later, like rolling the edges of the cylinder, adding the knurling around the screw-on section here, rounding the top of the cap and adding the dimple on top. But as a general statement, if we start with the coarsest features of an object and represent those with primitives, and then refine them as we go, iterating the part, creating more detail through subsequent operations, we'll get closer and closer to the final form that we're looking for. This applies to all kinds of objects. So let's go through a basic example together. We're going to represent an object using nothing more than primitive shapes, but as we work through the process, it's going to get more and more recognizable as we do the modeling. So once again, let's take a look at my screen here. And I've opened Fusion 360 and I'm starting with a brand new untitled part. So as is a good best practice, we will start by creating a component, and we will save our work. I'm going to call this building because, well, I'm going to spell it right. I'm calling it building because I think an interesting first example would be something architectural. So let's switch over to a browser window here, and let's start with the Empire State Building. And I think most people know what this building looks like, which is one of the reasons it's a good example for us to start with. It's one of the most famous buildings in New York City. And a quick Google image search, we find a whole bunch of very recognizable images. Actually, I think what might work better is let's start with the Wikipedia page. Okay, this is great. Okay, so we've got a bunch of information about the building, and we've got this very useful sort of, I think orthographic is the right term, orthographic view of the building. We can see it bottom to top. We can see the base of the building, which is handy because that's usually omitted in photographs. And because we're in the Wikipedia article, if we scroll down a little bit, we can also find some information about the dimensions of the building, which might come in handy. And if we scroll down further, a little far, yep, near the bottom, we've got this comparison where we get a cross-section view, and we've got sort of a relative size chart compared to other large buildings in the world. So the Wikipedia article gives us a bunch of information. So I think to start this exercise and illustrating the point of representing complicated shapes with as a collection of primitives, we should do sort of a rough estimated sort of, eyeball estimation of modeling this building. So let's switch back over to Fusion. And let's start the same way we did before, where we create a new sketch on the XY plane, and we go into our 2D drawing environment. So, like I said before, this is going to be a really rough estimate. We're going to start by drawing a rectangle like we did before. Now, I'm going to switch back over to the photo here. The top-down view of this building, of the main body section, is going to be roughly square. So let's start by drawing a square. So we can go into our rectangle tool. Now, in the previous video, in our previous example, we did a 2-point rectangle drawing out from the origin. But I think the way that we're going to end up representing this building is a series of stacked rectangles that would be sort of concentric. I'm not sure if that's technically the correct term when dealing with rectangles. I usually use that term when dealing with circular shapes. But anyway, a series of sort of concentric rectangles. And so I think maybe the right way to approach this to save us a little bit of time, maybe be a little more efficient, is to use the center rectangle tool. So if you choose that and then click on the origin, you can see when we stretch out to start drawing our rectangle, it centers it on the origin. And as before, we get 2 dimensions that we can specify. So I'm going to start with a 30 millimeter per side rectangle. And I'm going to click on Finish Sketch, and that's going to bring me back out to my 3D view. Now, I'm going to use the Pan tool to give myself a little bit of room. And I'm going to hit Escape to deselect that tool. And then I'm going to go back and use the Extrude tool like we have in the past to start stretching my sketch up into a 3rd dimension. Now, again, I'm eyeballing here. I think 70 looks a bit short. That looks a bit tall. Let's refer back to our picture. I guess actually, if I'm doing a rough estimation of the bottom section, I think 130 millimeters looks about right to me. You can be creative with your own design, modify it to suit you. And at least for now, that's a representation of our lower section. Now, I suppose in the broadest sense that looks a bit like a building, but if we're talking about kind of honing in on the shape that we're looking for using primitives, I think we need to add a few more details. So let's add another sketch. Do Create Sketch on that top surface again. And I'm going to use the center rectangle tool to add another rectangle to our drawing. Now we started with 30 millimeters. I think 25 on a side is going to get us pretty close to what we want for this next tier. We're going to extrude that like we did before. And if memory serves, this next section is sort of cubic. It's about the same height as the width. So I'm going to estimate that. And refer back to my drawing. Yeah, that's not bad. And I'm going to keep repeating this process. I'm going to create another sketch on the top surface. Again, I'm going to use the center rectangle. Snap to the origin. This time I'm going to do a 20 millimeter tier. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I'm going to use the Extrude tool. I'm going to extrude that up to 20 millimeters. Okay, so we're starting to define some features of this building. It's starting to take shape a little bit. For this next section, I'm going to follow the same process. The size is going to be different. Do center rectangle. This time it's going to be 15 millimeters on a side. And referring back to the article, this top section is getting a little bit shorter, right? I guess actually the previous section should have been a little shorter too. We could edit that if we wanted to. If I extrude this up, this time only a little bit. I think we want about 5 millimeters. Because the higher we get on the building, the shorter the sections get. And that's sort of what gives it its characteristic shape, right? So we want to pay attention to those details when we're looking at the object that we're copying, and then represent them, even just roughly. It's going to make a big difference. So at this point, the building transitions into this sort of tower section. So again, we'll create a new sketch on the top surface. Let's see, I guess it's sort of round. So this time, let's do a circle. Do a center diameter circle. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can see where I'm working here. And let's see, I think I want this to be about 5 millimeters in diameter. We'll OK out. We'll switch back to our 3D view. Zoom in on the top. E for extrude. I'm going to bring this up, I could say about 25 millimeters. I can't remember if I mentioned it before, but up in the view cube, which you can use to drag around and change your perspective, there's also this home button, which takes you back to a 3/4 view, but it also sort of centers your part in the design environment, I find to be a kind of a handy shortcut. Okay, so looks like we need a little bit more height to our tower. So we're going to create another sketch on top. Going to zoom in. Going to go back to the rectangular shape. I'm going to make this one about 1.5 millimeters on a side. Again, eyeballing it here. Choose dimensions that suit you as you're following along. And I'm going to extrude this out. And I think that's about the same height as the lower section of the tower. Okay, so let's take a look back at our reference drawing. Now, is this perfect? No. But I would say that anybody who's really familiar with this building, who took a look at the proportions of the thing that we just drew, would say that it's recognizable. I'd say we're getting pretty close. Now, in a future lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about changing the proportions of things like the sketches and the extrusions. I'm not going to go into that now, but if you're working through it and you decide that you want to change some of those proportions, you can find those extrude operations down here in the timeline. The icon is that sort of blue stretchy cube looking thing. Any of your extrude operations you can double click and it'll bring up the extrude parameters and you can change that dimension that you extruded to. So that's a really quick way for you to sort of revise those operations. Now, again, did we capture all of the detail? No. Looking at the picture, we omitted the base entirely. The lower tiers that sort of span the change from the center section from the base, there's a few lower tiers that sort of widen out the lower part of the main section of the building. Those could be added in. And actually, one of my favorite features of this building is in the long center section here in the photo, there's this sort of channel that runs down and cuts away from the lower and second and maybe part of the third tiers. Based on the work we did in the previous model, you should already know how to add a feature like that and cut away that section. So I would say, as a little bit of independent work for you guys following along with this lesson, why don't you go and add some of those features, okay? Add the base, add that cutaway, maybe add some of the supporting features on the tower that you see in the upper section. Something else I'd like to point out is that this building sort of has a texture to it. It's got a lot of windows all over the surface that sort of form indentations into the surface of the building, giving it that texture. Now, if you wanted to add those features in, you could do them one at a time, but that would be really tedious and really time-consuming. And so, as a bit of an exploration, I'd like you guys to go through the menus and look for a tool that Fusion gives you to create a pattern of features. And what I mean by that is maybe you can create a window and use a tool that's built in to repeat that window in a pattern across the surface of the building. I will tell you that that feature exists, and it's a great time saver. So go ahead and explore in Fusion, look for some of those tools, and get familiar with them. Again, exploring in the application is the best way for you to get comfortable and get fluent in the use of the tools. So that's some work for you to do on your own. I'm going to post another video up soon. That's going to be the next series of lessons. We're going to get into some more advanced operations, but ones that are really going to be necessary for you to do accurate part design. We're going to talk about measurements. We're going to talk about constraints and dimensions on your parts, which set the size of things and the locations of things in your models. And those are going to be important when we start getting into technical part modeling, where you need to have things like mounting locations in specific places to interface with objects that already exist in the real world. If you can't create those features in exact locations relative to parts that already exist, you're not going to be able to get them to meet up exactly. We're also going to talk about revising and iterating our designs, which is another great feature set in Fusion, and is something that everybody who's getting into 3D modeling needs to learn, because our models are never right the first time. We need to be able to go back and make iterative changes and improve our parts over time. So that'll be in the next lesson. I'll see you then.